Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. In this video, we're going to talk about rules and rulings and all that kind of good stuff. But first, Happy New Year. This should come out on the 2nd of January if all things go well. So I hope you all had a wonderful New Year's evening and day and all that good stuff. Anyways, let's get to it. There's obviously lots of debates about rules, how many rules we need, how to use the rules as written, rules as intended. And in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on rules and kind of where they fit in. So first of all, we're going to talk about the using rules. We're going to talk about making rulings, and I'm going to kind of give you my thoughts, both good and bad, about both sides of it. So first of all, let's start with the rules. So when we're talking about role-playing games, the rules are really what separates them from just playing make-believe, kind of in the kids' sense, because even if you were in an improv group, there's still usually rules that you're following within each setup you're doing, right? So you can't just do anything in those circumstances. But when you were a kid and you were playing make-believe, you could just do anything, right? There was no rules, you just did what you wanted. And that can be fun, certainly. But I think we've all been in that situation where I got you. No, you didn't. I got you. No, you didn't. Right? So this is where the rules come in. The rules are a unbiased arbitrator of situations that need it, right? We need the rules in order to make decisions that are fair for everyone, especially when two sides are clashing. The other reason why we need rules and why rules are super important is because it sets a baseline for everyone playing the game as to what to expect. If a player is playing the game and they understand the rules of using their bow, then they can make an informed decision, make a meaningful choice about whether using the bow or not is a good idea. Having the rules well defined is going to make it much easier for people to make choices and not feel like, oh man, that really didn't work out. That wasn't fair. Okay, so that should be the whole video, right? Well, not really, right? When are rules a problem? Well, the thing about role-playing games is that they're not board games or card games or sports. And even in those, I'm sure there's issues, but you're never going to find a game that has everything defined, every rule defined, every circumstance. This is why we love, at least me, role-playing games, because they're open-ended. They could be anything. So there's not going to be a rule for everything. So we can't fall back on them all the time. We have to understand the idea of the rules as a whole, what they're trying to accomplish in order to be able to make rulings, which I'll talk about in a second. But what I'm going to talk about here quickly is what often is referred to as the rules lawyer or rules lawyering. This is where rules can become problematic. When people start digging into the rules so specifically that they're twisting the intention of them. And again, we're hoping, like this, I'm here by myself, but I'm hoping that you don't play with people that do that often. I mean, everybody's tempted occasionally to twist that rule, but most people, I think, understand fair play and will understand how the rules are supposed to work, even if there is a comma where there should have been a period in the writing of the rule. Because we can't always follow the rules to the T the way they're written, because sometimes it's unclear. This is where a fair arbitrator or a referee, which is the role of the dungeon master in Dungeons & Dragons, for instance, comes in. We can't argue about the rules constantly. Somebody has to be the final arbitrator. So if you're playing in a game where there's rules and there might be questions, everyone should have their say. And the arbitrator in the end might end up being the table. You might vote, but you should have that set up ahead of time. Who decides when it's unclear? I think this is one thing we need to do in order for rules not to become blockades for us. There is this idea that, well, two sides, right? And of course, there's lots of gray area in between, but we always talk about the two sides. The idea that if it's not in the rules, you can't do it. Or the idea, if it's not in the rules, it means you can do it because the rules aren't saying you can't. Somewhere in the middle is fun play. So always keep that in mind when you're looking at the rules. They're there to be unbiased. They're there to give us a baseline. But in the end, it's the interpretation of the table that's going to make those rules work for you or not. Okay, let's dive into rulings and my philosophy on this. We hear a lot in the old school sphere, rulings over rules. What does this even mean? Does it mean that the ruling is more important than the rule, that rules aren't important and rulings are the most important thing? Did I just say the same thing twice? I don't take it as that. What I take it as is that we don't need a rule for everything because, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of situations that will come up that might only come up once in an entire campaign, once in your entire time ever playing the game. There's lots and lots and lots and lots, can I say lots one more time, of unique situations that we're going to encounter. This is where rulings come in. When we're making a ruling as a dungeon master or deciding as a table, we want to think about what rules might be applicable. And we're going to use these rules as a baseline to make our decision. So when a situation comes up, as unique as it might be, there might be another situation that is similar, but the rule doesn't actually cover it. And we can look at that situation and say, okay, what can we do here? So for instance, if we go all the ways back to original Dungeons and Dragons, there's a rule for opening doors that are stuck because doors are stuck. What if instead there's a stone in front of you, or there's a portcullis that has fallen down, or you want to open a window? There's not rules for that. And later they add those rules, but we're not talking about that right now. So if you were sitting there in 1974, which I was not, and you were looking at these rules and somebody wanted to open up a window that was stuck or whatever, you might look at the rules for opening doors and then adjust it based on the situation. Also, the rule for opening doors just assumes you're throwing your shoulder into it. What if you bring a large log and slam the door open? What do we do there? This is where a ruling comes in. You have to look at the rule and say, well, this is what it's considering, and this is how we're going to modify it. You'll hear people say that once you make a ruling, it becomes a rule, and I don't stick to that myself. I think that in most cases that I'm making rulings, those things aren't going to come up again exactly the same way, so they won't become rules. But if somehow they come up again, then, you keep track of it. If you see, okay, we're constantly figuring out how this is handled, and really these situations are very similar, let's make a rule to handle this. Let's call it the portal opening rule, and that's going to cover everything. And then you have a rule that you can then refer back to and the players can understand, and you go from there. The other thing I would say about a ruling is that as the referee, I think it's very important to be clear, and this might be slightly controversial, with your players. I know that some people are like, oh, you want to open the door? Roll your dice. I find that it's good policy to give the players an idea what their chance is. I know that it's not, I'm going to use the word realistic, that you would know you have a 37% chance to open the door. But it's important that the players have an idea so again, they can make meaningful choices. It is a game after all. One thing we want to avoid both with rules and their interpretation and rulings in places where there's no rules or the rules aren't clear, I might have again said the same thing twice, is being too arbitrary. It's important that if you are running the game, that you are as neutral and fair as possible. That is to say, and I'm going to use a term, people often talk about the rule of cool, meaning that this is generally how the meaning goes, that it basically says in the rule one thing and you're changing it because it's cool at the session or at the table. That sounds amazing on the surface until you realize that who has the right to change the rule? Who is making this decision? And who thinks it's cool? What if I have an idea that I think is great, but the DM and I just don't have the same kind of thoughts on fantasy? And they're just like, oh, no, that won't work. And then another player comes up with something just as rule breaking, and the DM's like, yeah, that's cool, you can do it. That's not fair. So we need to make sure that we're not making arbitrary rulings. We need to make sure that we're really considering whether or not we're just bringing our own emotions into it, our own likes. It falls back to, let's say, the inspiration mechanic, as I've seen it used many, many times, in 5th edition, where you make the DM laugh and you get a point. Well, what if I don't make the DM laugh because we don't have the same sense of humor? Is that fair to me? That rule is an unfair rule when used like that. It's arbitrary and it's really not very good in my opinion. So how would we fix that? Let's say you're going to use an inspiration type mechanic. Fixing it to some kind of activity makes the most sense to me. If you roll a critical failure, you get a point of inspiration as a kind of like a little boost up, or you could do the opposite. You roll a critical success, you get a point of inspiration representing that, you're now super motivated. Both things work. Both things take the DM's hands out of it. This is how I think about making rules and changing rules, because we're just going to quickly hint on the idea of house rules or homebrew. These things are not the same as rulings. Rulings are something you do at the table, at the time the situation is happening, when there's no rule that applies. House rules are something you make before the campaign starts, or possibly somewhere in the campaign based on what's been happening, and generally you want to make sure that the table is on board with all of this stuff. Generally, you should always make sure the table's on board with all of this stuff before you start messing with the rules, because again, the rules are the baseline the players use to understand the game. If you're changing them constantly, they can't understand the game, they can't make meaningful decisions. So where do we stand here? Rules are super important. Running the game willy-nilly, so as they say, is not going to lead to long-term satisfaction, in my opinion. Go ahead and let me know in the comments below if you've run a campaign some other way. If you're just making it up as you go along, the players will have a hard time understanding what their position is, what they can do. Now, there are certain styles of games that are very open-ended, but even in those, people understand the basics. They understand the general idea. If you're running a historical war game and there's very loose rules, but you understand that a rifle, shoots bullets, and that, a horse is something you can ride on, and that, trees might block sight. These are things that are in your head. They make sense. You don't need to have a rule for that per se written down. Cool. But that's because everybody has a shared understanding. When you're talking about a fantasy adventure game, do we all understand the physics of the world? That's what the rules are for. So I would love to know what you think about this. Let me know in the comments below about any cool ideas that you have about making rulings, any rules that you've made for your game that have stuck, that do really well, all that good stuff. I would love to know in the comments. Check out the description, and there you're going to find links to a bunch of my stuff, including my Discord server where you can join up and talk about rules all day or other things. And finally, down there, you're going to find a link to my Patreon. Go ahead and support the channel if you feel like it, and I will talk to you soon.